A legacy of change. Months had passed since the incident at Pine Grove Park, but the ripples of that day were still being felt. The media frenzy had waned, but the movement it sparked continued to gain momentum. Breonna Carter, now a reluctant public figure, stood at the epicenter of a fight that was reshaping Atlanta, and perhaps, in time, the nation. In her quiet moments, Breonna often reflected on the weight of her decision to stand her ground that morning. It wasn't just about confronting Derek Harrison. It was about challenging a deeply entrenched system of inequality and corruption. And while the fight was far from over, each step forward felt like a victory. The Police Reform Task Force. The Department of Justice's investigation had gone beyond the local precinct, uncovering a network of corruption that implicated several high-ranking officials. Following the convictions of Derek Harrison and Councilman Billings, public trust in the Atlanta Police Department was at an all-time low. To address the crisis, the mayor's office established a police reform task force, and Breonna was asked to join as a consultant. At first, Breonna was hesitant. Her job as an FBI agent was already demanding, and the thought of stepping further into the public eye didn't appeal to her. But as she sat in her office, reading yet another email from a community member thanking her for speaking out, she realized she couldn't walk away. Agent Carter, Mayor Lisa Bryant had said during their first meeting, "You've become a symbol of accountability and justice. If we're going to rebuild trust, we need people like you leading the way." The task force meetings were grueling. Breonna found herself sitting across from police officers, civil rights activists, lawyers, and community leaders, each with their own ideas about how to fix a broken system. The discussions were heated, with debates ranging from the use of body cameras to the establishment of civilian oversight boards. One particularly tense meeting centered on qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shielded officers from accountability. "If we strip away protections, how can officers do their jobs?" asked Captain Ray Miller, a veteran officer on the task force. Breonna didn't flinch. "By following the law and treating people with respect," she replied. "Accountability doesn't weaken policing, it strengthens it. The community isn't asking for perfection, they're asking for fairness." Her words hung in the air, a challenge no one could refute. Slowly but surely, the task force began to outline a series of reforms that balanced public safety with accountability. Among the proposals were mandatory de-escalation training, independent investigations of misconduct, and the establishment of a community oversight board with subpoena power. The Community Oversight Board. One of the most transformative outcomes of the task force's work was the creation of the Community Oversight Board, COB. The board was designed to review complaints against officers, ensure transparency in investigations, and recommend disciplinary actions. Angela King, the activist who had rallied the community during the height of the scandal, was elected chair of the COB. Her tireless advocacy had earned her the respect of both the community and law enforcement, and her leadership brought a sense of legitimacy to the new institution. At the inaugural meeting of the COB, Angela invited Breonna to speak. The room was packed with reporters, community members, and police officers, all eager to see what this new chapter would bring. Standing at the podium, Breonna addressed the crowd. "This board isn't just about accountability, it's about partnership. It's about creating a system where the community and law enforcement work together to ensure justice for everyone. Change doesn't happen overnight, but today, we're taking a critical step forward." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Breonna felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like the community and the police were on the same side. Personal reflection and growth. Despite her public role, Breonna remained deeply private. She often found solace in her morning jogs, returning to Pine Grove Park, a place that had once been a battleground but now felt like a symbol of resilience. The park had become a meeting place for activists, students, and families who wanted to be part of the movement for change. One morning, as she ran past the lake, she noticed a young girl sitting on a bench, sketching in a notebook. The girl looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized Breonna. "Excuse me," the girl said, hesitantly. "Are you the FBI agent from the news?" Brianna stopped, smiling. "I am." "What's your name?" "Imani," the girl replied, clutching her notebook tightly. "I've been following your story. I want to be like you when I grow up." Brianna knelt down, her heart swelling with pride and humility. "You can be anything you want to be, Imani. And if you ever need help, I'll be here." Imani beamed, and Brianna felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her fight wasn't just about policy or accountability, it was about inspiring the next generation to demand better. The final showdown. As the movement for reform gained traction, not everyone was supportive. Brianna received her fair share of threats, angry letters, anonymous phone calls, and online harassment. She brushed most of it off, but one incident crossed the line. Late one evening, Brianna returned to her apartment to find her front door ajar. Her heart raced as she drew her weapon, clearing each room with the precision of a trained agent. In her living room, she found a single note taped to the wall. It read, "Stop pushing. You're making enemies you can't handle." She immediately reported the threat, and an investigation revealed that the break-in was likely connected to individuals implicated in the corruption case. Despite the danger, Brianna refused to back down. Nicole Ramsey reached out the next day. "Do you want protection?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. "No," Brianna replied firmly. "If they think intimidation will work, they're wrong. This only makes me more determined." Victory and vindication. By the end of the year, the reforms spearheaded by the task force began to take effect. The Atlanta Police Department implemented new policies, and officers underwent comprehensive training on de-escalation and implicit bias. The Community Oversight Board began reviewing cases, and their first report revealed significant progress in rebuilding trust. Councilman Billings and several others implicated in the corruption scandal were convicted, their sentences sending a clear message that no one was above the law. The DOJ's investigation expanded to other cities, using Atlanta as a blueprint for systemic reform. For Brianna, the victory was bittersweet. She had achieved more than she'd ever imagined, but the cost had been high. Still, as she stood on stage at a national policing reform summit, addressing an audience of activists, officers, and lawmakers, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "It's just the beginning. Change is hard, and justice is a constant fight. But together, we can build a future where fairness and accountability aren't ideals, they're realities." The standing ovation that followed was a testament to the impact of her work. Brianna had become more than an agent, more than an advocate. She was a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. Epilogue: Seeds of a Movement. A year after the incident, Brianna returned to Pine Grove Park for a community event celebrating the progress made. Families picnicked, children played, and activists mingled with police officers in a display of unity that had once seemed impossible. As she stood by the lake, Imani approached her, now clutching a folder of college applications. "I'm applying to schools for criminal justice," the girl said proudly. "I want to make a difference." Brianna smiled, her heart full. "You already are, Imani." As the sun set over the park, Brianna felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time, she believed they were heading in the right direction. Together, they had planted the seeds of a movement that would grow far beyond Atlanta, leaving a legacy of hope and change for generations to come. This concludes Part 6, focusing on the long-term impact of Brianna's actions, the reforms achieved, and the personal growth and inspiration she fostered in others. Let me know if you'd like any further revisions or additional details. The Unraveling. The Atlanta skyline glowed against the night sky, the city's lights twinkling like distant stars. In her office at the FBI field headquarters, Brianna Carter sifted through the evidence piling up against Derek Harrison and the network of corruption that had shielded him. Each new discovery felt like another thread in a tangled web, and Brianna was determined to unravel it. Her laptop pinged with an incoming email from Daniel Rojas. The subject line read, "Key evidence, follow the money." She clicked it open, her sharp eyes scanning the attached documents. Daniel had traced payments from the shell company funding Harrison's operations to a city councilman, Jason Billings, known for his connections to the developer pushing gentrification projects. Billings had approved several zoning changes that disproportionately displaced black and low-income families, a move Harrison's targeted harassment had facilitated. "Bingo," Brianna muttered under her breath. The email also included a timeline linking Harrison's actions directly to the councilman's financial gains. Brianna leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This was bigger than one rogue officer. It was a calculated operation that used police power to line the pockets of the city's elite. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Ramsey. "Nicole," Brianna answered, her tone brisk. "I just got Daniel's email. We've got enough to go after the councilman." "That's what I wanted to talk about," Nicole replied. "But before we move forward, we need more. The DOJ's watching this closely, and they'll want airtight evidence before we bring charges." "What's the play?" Brianna asked. Nicole hesitated for a moment. "We need Harrison to flip." Brianna frowned. She'd dealt with men like Harrison before, arrogant, entitled, and deeply loyal to their protectors. Getting him to talk wouldn't be easy, but she knew it was their best chance to expose the full extent of the corruption. "I'll set it up," Brianna said. "But if he thinks he can bluff his way out, he's in for a rude awakening." The interrogation. The following morning, Brianna and Nicole sat in a dimly lit interview room at the FBI field office. Across the table sat Derek Harrison, his posture stiff and defensive. The once cocky officer looked haggard, his face pale and his hands fidgeting nervously. "You know why you're here," Nicole began, her voice sharp and professional. "We've got enough evidence to charge you with misconduct, assault, and corruption. But this isn't just about you, Officer Harrison. It's about the people you've been working with." "I don't know what you're talking about," Harrison replied, his voice laced with defiance. "I was doing my job. Everything I did was by the book." Brianna leaned forward, her piercing gaze fixed on him. "Kicking my phone out of my hand was by the book. Harassing people out of their homes, was that by the book too?" Harrison shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Brianna pressed on. "We've traced the payments, Derek. From the developer's shell company, through your bank account, and straight to Councilman Billings. You've been helping him and his friends profit off the displacement of vulnerable communities. And now, you're the one holding the bag." "That's nonsense," Harrison snapped, though the crack in his voice betrayed his fear. "You can't prove anything." Nicole slid a stack of documents across the table. "This is a complete breakdown of the payments you've received, along with emails and text messages linking you to Billings and the developer. You can try to deny it, but this evidence will hold up in court." Harrison's eyes flicked over the documents, his jaw tightening. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. "Here's the deal," Nicole continued. "You cooperate with us, give us names, dates, and details, and we'll recommend leniency when this goes to trial. Refuse, and you'll go down for everything. And I mean everything." Brianna's voice was cold as ice as she added, "The people you're protecting? They won't lift a finger to save you once this blows up. You're expendable to them, Derek. You always were." Harrison's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He glanced between Brianna and Nicole, his defiance crumbling. "What do you want to know?" he asked quietly. The dominoes begin to fall. Over the next several hours, Harrison detailed his involvement in the corruption scheme. He admitted to harassing residents on the developer's behalf, falsifying reports, and using his position to intimidate anyone who resisted. He provided key evidence linking Councilman Billings to the operation, including emails instructing him to clear the area for upcoming development projects. With this testimony, Nicole and her team began assembling an airtight case. Warrants were issued for Billings and several other officials tied to the scheme. By the end of the week, the story dominated headlines. Police corruption scandal rocks Atlanta, Councilman Jason Billings indicted. FBI agent Brianna Carter leads effort to expose systemic abuse. Brianna watched the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The fight wasn't over, but this was a significant victory. The voices of the displaced residents, silenced for so long, were finally being heard. A community transformed. As the case unfolded, community leaders and activists capitalized on the momentum to push for broader reforms. Angela King, the activist who had led the rally outside the precinct, became a leading voice in the movement. She organized town halls and meetings, bringing together residents, lawmakers, and law enforcement to discuss solutions. Brianna attended one of these meetings, standing quietly at the back of the room as Angela addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about punishing the people who did wrong," Angela said. "It's about rebuilding trust, creating systems of accountability, and ensuring this never happens again." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy electrifying. Brianna felt a swell of pride as she listened. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Harrison's reckoning. Weeks later, Derek Harrison stood before a judge in a packed courtroom. His once imposing figure now seemed small and defeated. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison, a punishment that reflected not only his crimes but the damage he'd done to the community. As Harrison was led away in handcuffs, Brianna watched from the gallery. She felt no triumph, only resolve. His conviction was a step in the right direction, but the fight for justice was far from over. A new chapter. Months after the incident in the park, Brianna stood in front of a podium at a community event. She had been invited to speak as a guest of honor, a recognition of her role in exposing corruption and standing up for justice. "I didn't set out to become a symbol," Brianna began, her voice steady. "But sometimes, life puts you in a position where you have to make a choice. Do you stand up, or do you stand by? I chose to stand up, not just for myself, but for every person who's been silenced, intimidated, or ignored." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the park. Brianna smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. A system exposed. The morning after the park incident, Brianna Carter woke to a world still reeling from the viral footage. Her phone buzzed incessantly, but she forced herself to take a moment of quiet reflection before diving into the storm. Sitting on her balcony with a steaming cup of coffee, she breathed deeply, letting the crisp air center her. The fight ahead wouldn't just be about holding Derek Harrison accountable, it would mean exposing a system that enabled his behavior. Her reprieve was short-lived. The doorbell rang, and she opened it to find Daniel Rojas standing there again, this time carrying a slim briefcase and a tablet under his arm. "Morning," he greeted with a grim smile. "You're not going to believe what's in this." Brianna ushered him inside, already feeling the weight of his words. "What is it?" Daniel set his tablet on the coffee table, tapping a few times before handing it to her. "Internal Affairs has begun their investigation, but I've been digging deeper. Harrison isn't just a bad cop, he's part of a larger network of officers who've been covering for each other for years." Brianna's brow furrowed as she scrolled through the files on the tablet. Names, dates, and incident reports appeared in neat columns. Complaints against officers for excessive force and racial profiling were marked unsubstantiated, while others were dismissed outright. She recognized some of the names, officers she'd encountered during joint task forces or in casual professional settings. "This isn't just negligence," Brianna said, her voice hardening. "It's intentional. They're protecting each other." Daniel nodded. "It's a code of silence. Harrison has been named in at least 5 different complaints that were swept under the rug. In one case, a woman came forward about a traffic stop where he harassed her for an hour. She filed a complaint, but the report never made it past the precinct. Brianna's stomach churned. How is he still wearing a badge? Because he's useful, Daniel explained. Harrison isn't the top of the pyramid. He's a pawn, a bulldog used by people higher up who need someone willing to do the dirty work. When things get messy, they shield him, and the system keeps turning. Brianna's hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just about Derek Harrison anymore, it was about dismantling the entire structure that allowed officers like him to thrive. The precinct under pressure. At the local precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers spoke in hushed tones as news outlets camped outside, their cameras trained on the building. Lieutenant Karen Mitchell paced in her office, reviewing the growing mountain of evidence against Harrison. Her phone rang constantly, calls from reporters, community leaders, and even politicians demanding answers. Across the hall, Derek sat in the locker room, staring at the empty space where his badge and gun had been. The humiliation of being placed on administrative leave weighed heavily on him. Worse, he could feel the cracks forming in the solidarity he'd always relied on. Some officers had stopped meeting his gaze. Others avoided him entirely. His phone buzzed with a text message from a number he recognized immediately, Chief Lawson. "We need to talk. Now." Derek hesitated for a moment before heading to the chief's office. When he entered, he found Chief Lawson standing by the window, arms crossed. The older man's face was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Sit down," Lawson said curtly. Derek obeyed, his usual bravado diminished. "Chief, this whole thing is being blown out of proportion." "That woman." "Agent Carter," Lawson interrupted sharply. "You'll refer to her as Agent Carter. And don't bother with excuses, I've seen the video." Derek's face reddened. "It was a misunderstanding. She didn't do anything wrong, and you damn well know it," Lawson snapped. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've brought to this department? The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. Internal Affairs is opening investigations on half the squad because of you." "I was doing my job," Derek protested, his voice rising. "You're the one who always said we needed to take control out there, to keep things in check." Lawson's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare pin this on me. I told you to keep order, not turn the department into a liability. You've put a spotlight on everything we've tried to keep out of public view. Now the DOJ is sniffing around, and they're not going to stop until they find something." The mention of the Department of Justice sent a chill down Derek's spine. He'd always assumed the shield of his uniform would protect him. But now, with the whole country watching, even his allies were beginning to falter. "What do you want me to do?" Derek asked, his voice quieter now. Lawson leaned in, his tone icy. "I want you to stay out of the way while we clean up the mess you made. And if you think about dragging anyone else down with you, remember who kept you out of prison the last time your temper got the better of you." Derek's stomach dropped. He nodded silently, knowing he had no other choice. Brianna takes the fight to the DOJ. Later that afternoon, Brianna sat in a conference room at the FBI field office in Atlanta. Across from her was Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Ramsey, a no-nonsense prosecutor with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases. She wore a tailored suit and had an air of quiet confidence that immediately put Brianna at ease. "I've reviewed the evidence you sent over," Nicole began, sliding a folder across the table. "There's more than enough to pursue action against Harrison. But if we're going to make this stick, we need to go beyond him. This is systemic, and we both know it." Brianna nodded. "I want to go after everyone involved, the officers who covered for him, the precinct leadership that enabled him, even the city officials who ignored the complaints." Nicole smiled faintly. "That's what I like to hear. But it won't be easy. These cases take time, and the people we're targeting have resources. They'll do everything they can to discredit you and bury this. I'm ready for that, Brianna said firmly. This isn't just about me. It's about the people who don't have the resources or the voice to stand up to this kind of abuse. Nicole studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. Let's start with Harrison. We'll subpoena his personnel records, financials, and anything else we can find. From there, we'll follow the trail up the chain. The determination in Nicole's voice was infectious. For the first time since the incident, Brianna felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility of real change. The community rallies. While Brianna and Nicole strategized, the community was mobilizing. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and activists had organized a rally outside the precinct, demanding accountability not just for Harrison but for the entire department. Hundreds of people gathered with signs, chanting slogans like, "Justice for all," and "End police abuse." Among the crowd was Angela King, a local activist who had been advocating for police reform for years. She took the stage with a megaphone, her voice ringing out over the crowd. This is about more than one officer. Angela declared. This is about a culture of abuse that has gone unchecked for too long. Brianna Carter stood up for herself, and now it's time for us to stand with her. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. News crews captured the scene, broadcasting the rally across the country. Brianna watched from a distance, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew she wasn't alone in this fight. The first crack. That evening, Daniel called with an update. Harrison's financials came back, he said. You're going to want to see this. Brianna met him at his office, where he showed her a series of transactions that painted a damning picture. Harrison had been receiving regular payments from a shell company linked to a local developer. In return, he'd been using his position to harass residents in predominantly black neighborhoods, paving the way for gentrification projects. This isn't just police misconduct, Brianna said, her voice laced with anger. It's corruption. Daniel nodded. And now we've got a thread to pull. If we can connect this to his superiors, we'll have a case that goes far beyond Harrison. Brianna leaned back in her chair, a sense of purpose settling over her. The fight wasn't over, but the cracks in the system were beginning to show. Fallout and firestorm. The viral videos of the park incident had spread like wildfire. By the time Brianna Carter returned home and logged onto her laptop, she found herself at the center of a national conversation. Her social media notifications were a relentless barrage of messages, both supportive and critical, as hashtags like #JusticeForBrianna, #AbuseOfPower, and #AccountabilityNow trended across platforms. Local news stations had picked up the story, and by the afternoon, it had reached national outlets. For many, Brianna's confrontation with Derek Harrison was more than an isolated incident, it was a microcosm of broader issues in policing, race, and power. Brianna sipped her tea, trying to process the whirlwind of attention. Her cracked phone, now resting on her kitchen counter, served as a stark reminder of how quickly a calm morning could descend into chaos. She'd already sent a formal complaint to the local police precinct, along with a copy of the video evidence. Her FBI colleagues had reached out, offering support and expressing outrage over the treatment she'd endured. Still, Brianna knew this was far from over. Her doorbell rang, jolting her from her thoughts. She rose, peering through the peephole to see her close friend and fellow FBI agent, Daniel Rojas, standing on the porch. His sharp suit and the ever-present briefcase in his hand gave him a no-nonsense appearance, but his warm smile softened the edges. Brianna, he greeted her as she opened the door. I figured you could use some backup. She stepped aside, letting him in. Backup for what? The internet's already doing most of the work, she said with a wry smile, motioning toward her laptop. Daniel glanced at the screen, where a flood of comments rolled in under a repost of the video. Yeah, the public's on your side, but you know how these things go. It's only a matter of time before the backlash starts. Brianna raised an eyebrow. Backlash? I didn't do anything wrong. You didn't, Daniel agreed, setting his briefcase on the table. But the other side always finds a way to spin it. You know this. People will start questioning your actions, your motives, even your character. They'll dig into your past, looking for anything to undermine you. Brianna sighed, sinking into a chair. I shouldn't have to defend myself for standing up to him. The badge I carry should mean something. It does, Daniel said gently. But you're not just dealing with one bad cop. You're up against a system that's built to protect people like him. The truth of his words settled over her like a weight. Brianna had spent years working to uphold the law, chasing down criminals and dismantling corrupt networks. But this was different. This was personal. Daniel opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick file. I've been looking into Officer Harrison. Thought you might want to see this. Brianna's curiosity piqued. She reached for the file, flipping it open to reveal a series of reports, complaints, and disciplinary actions. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the documents. He's been accused of misconduct before, Daniel explained. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse. Most of it was swept under the rug, but there's a pattern. Of course there is, Brianna muttered, her jaw tightening. And no one's held him accountable. Not yet, Daniel said. But your case might be the one that changes that. You've got public attention, video evidence, and the weight of the FBI behind you. If you play this right, we can take him down, and maybe shake up the system in the process. Brianna leaned back in her chair, staring at the file. Part of her wanted to let the system handle it, to trust that justice would be served. But another part, the part that had endured years of subtle and overt racism in her career, knew better. If she didn't take an active role in this fight, she couldn't be sure it would end the way it should. What's the next step? She asked, her voice steady. Daniel smiled, sensing her resolve. We start by making this official. I've already contacted Internal Affairs, and they're launching an investigation. But we're not stopping there. I'm going to dig deeper into Harrison's past, see if there's anything we can use to show a pattern of abuse. Meanwhile, you keep doing what you're doing, being the face of this fight. People are rallying behind you, Brianna. Use that. She nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't get away with this. Meanwhile, at the precinct. Derek Harrison sat in the small, windowless room used for internal interviews, his face a mixture of defiance and unease. Across from him sat Lieutenant Karen Mitchell, head of Internal Affairs, her sharp eyes fixed on him as she reviewed the growing stack of complaints in front of her. You're lucky you still have your badge, Harrison, she said bluntly, not looking up from the papers. Frankly, if it were up to me, you'd already be on administrative leave. This is ridiculous, Derek snapped. I was doing my job. She was acting suspicious, and I had every right to question her. Karen finally looked up, her expression one of incredulity. Acting suspicious? She was jogging in a public park. The only thing suspicious about her was that she didn't back down when you tried to intimidate her. I didn't intimidate her, Derek said, his voice rising. She escalated the situation. And what was I supposed to do when she started recording me? Just let her. Yes, Harrison, Karen interrupted, her tone icy. That's exactly what you should have done. Because now, thanks to your ego and lack of judgment, we're in the middle of a PR nightmare. She gestured toward the folder on her desk. Do you know how many complaints I've received in the last 24 hours? How many videos I've had to watch of you kicking her phone and acting like a damn fool in front of half the city? Derek clenched his fists, his jaw working as he fought to keep his temper in check. This is a witch hunt, he muttered. She's using her position to. Karen slammed her hand on the desk, cutting him off. Enough. You don't get to play the victim here, Harrison. You crossed a line you've been towing for years. And now, it's catching up to you. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving his. Internal Affairs is officially opening an investigation into your conduct. You'll be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Turn in your badge and gun before the end of the day. Derek's face turned crimson, his defiance giving way to panic. You can't do this, he said, his voice trembling. I've been on the force for 20 years. And in those 20 years, you've managed to rack up more complaints than half the department combined, Karen said coldly. This isn't just about Brianna Carter. This is about every person you've bullied, every line you've crossed. The difference now is that the world is watching. She stood, gathering the papers into a neat stack. You have until 5 o'clock, Harrison. Don't make this harder on yourself. Back at home. As the evening settled over the city, Brianna sat on her couch, scrolling through her messages. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had reached out, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own stories of injustice. For every hateful comment or accusation, there were 10 more messages of support. Her phone buzzed with a call from her supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Rebecca Holden. Brianna answered, her voice steady despite the exhaustion she felt. Agent Carter, Rebecca began, her tone firm but supportive. I've been briefed on what happened. Let me start by saying that the Bureau stands behind you. Thank you, ma'am, Brianna said. I appreciate that. That being said, Rebecca continued, this situation has the potential to escalate even further. The public's watching, and so is the department. We need to tread carefully. Make sure everything you say and do from this point on reflects the professionalism of the Bureau. I understand, Brianna said. But I'm not backing down. Rebecca paused, then said, I didn't expect you to. Keep me updated, and let me know if you need anything. We'll get through this. As the call ended, Brianna set her phone down and leaned back, her mind racing. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But as she stared at the growing pile of evidence on her coffee table, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding Derek Harrison accountable. It was about proving that no one, no matter their rank or position, was above the law. The ripple effect. The air in Pine Grove Park felt heavier as Brianna Carter held up her FBI badge, the glint of the emblem catching the sunlight. The weight of the situation shifted dramatically. Derek Harrison's smirk faltered as recognition dawned. His expression flickered between disbelief and panic before he forced a mask of feigned authority back onto his face. The crowd, now visibly larger, buzzed with murmurs and the hum of live-streaming phones. Bystanders whispered in growing astonishment as they processed what they were witnessing. Some looked furious, others energized by what felt like an overdue reckoning. Brianna lowered her badge but kept her gaze locked on Derek's, her voice cold and commanding. You've just made a grave mistake, Officer Harrison, she said. Do you even understand the implications of what you've done? For a moment, Derek was silent, his jaw tightening as he stood frozen. The badge in her hand was undeniable proof that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. His carefully constructed facade of dominance cracked as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Yet his pride wouldn't allow him to fully back down, not in front of the growing crowd. You think flashing a badge changes anything? He spat, his voice harsher now, as if doubling down would salvage the last shred of his authority. You're still in my jurisdiction, and I'm doing my job. Brianna tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of a wry smile crossing her lips. She'd dealt with men like Derek before, bullies who cloaked their insecurities in the guise of power. But this wasn't just a routine case of overreach. This was a moment to set an example. Your jurisdiction doesn't give you the right to assault citizens, she replied evenly, gesturing toward her damaged phone on the ground. Or abuse your authority. The crowd began to grow louder, their voices rising in support of Brianna. One man stepped forward, holding up his phone. "We saw everything. You had no reason to do that." Another woman chimed in, "She wasn't doing anything wrong. You just targeted her for no reason." Derek's eyes darted toward the onlookers, his mounting panic barely concealed behind a scowl. He hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny. What had started as a simple flex of power had spiraled into a public spectacle, and the woman standing before him wasn't someone he could intimidate into submission. "I'll handle this," he snapped, glaring at the crowd. But his voice wavered, and the authority he once exuded now felt hollow. Brianna, sensing his uncertainty, seized the opportunity. She stepped closer, her voice dropping low enough for only Derek to hear. "Do you have any idea how far this will go? The badge I'm holding isn't just for show, Officer Harrison. What you've done today won't just disappear because you barked orders at a crowd." For the first time, Derek didn't respond. His bravado faltered as beads of sweat began to form on his brow. He knew she was right, but his pride refused to let him admit defeat. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial aggression now curdled into a sinking sense of dread. The standoff between them was interrupted when a new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd parted slightly as a second officer approached. This one was younger, with an air of professionalism that starkly contrasted Derek's hostility. His nameplate read J. Morales, and his calm demeanor seemed to diffuse the immediate tension. Brianna turned to Morales, grateful for the interruption but unwilling to let Derek off the hook. "Yes, Officer Morales," she said, her tone clipped but professional. "Your partner here has just assaulted me, destroyed my property, and attempted to intimidate me without cause. I've identified myself as a federal agent, and he has continued to escalate the situation." Morales blinked, his eyes darting from Brianna to Derek and then to the crowd, many of whom were still recording. It didn't take him long to assess the gravity of the situation. His posture straightened, and his tone shifted to one of deference. "Ma'am, I assure you will handle this appropriately," Morales said, his gaze settling on Derek with a mixture of confusion and disapproval. "Let me." Before he could finish, Derek interjected, his voice raised and defensive. "There's nothing to handle, Morales. She was acting suspicious, refused to cooperate, and..." "She's an FBI agent," Morales cut him off sharply. "And we're standing in front of half the city on their phones right now. Think carefully about what you say next." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Morales's intervention. Several people shouted in support of Brianna, their voices forming a chorus of discontent. "You can't just cover this up. Fire him. He doesn't deserve that badge." Derek's face turned red, his jaw clenched tightly as he struggled to maintain his composure. Morales, sensing the crowd's anger, turned back to Brianna. "Ma'am, if you'd like to file a formal complaint, we can take this back to the precinct and..." "Oh, there's no need to wait," Brianna interrupted, her voice steely. "I've already gathered all the evidence I need. Between my phone's recording and the videos from these witnesses, it's clear that Officer Harrison has overstepped his bounds. This isn't just a matter for your precinct, it's a matter for the federal authorities." Morales paled slightly, realizing the full extent of the situation. "I understand, ma'am. Please know that." "Save it for your superiors," Brianna said, cutting him off. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm. She bent down to pick up her phone, examining the cracked screen with a sigh. "I'll be in touch with your Internal Affairs Department. And I'll be making sure this reaches the DOJ." The weight of her words hung in the air, a promise that resonated deeply with the crowd. Derek, who had remained silent during the exchange, looked as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. His eyes darted around the scene, desperate for a way out. The moment was broken by the sound of an elderly man stepping forward from the crowd. He held up his own phone, its screen displaying a live feed with thousands of viewers. "You see this, officer," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "This isn't going away. Not today, not tomorrow." The crowd cheered softly, their voices filled with determination. Derek's shoulders slumped ever so slightly as he realized the depth of the mess he had created. Morales stepped between him and Brianna, his tone more authoritative now. "Let's take this back to the precinct," Morales said to Derek. "Now." For a moment, it seemed as though Derek might resist. But with the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, and the undeniable reality of Brianna's badge, he relented. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his patrol car, his movements stiff and robotic. The crowd erupted into applause as Derek retreated, their cheers filled with relief and vindication. Brianna watched him go, her expression unreadable. Morales turned back to her, his face apologetic. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for." "Save it," Brianna said, cutting him off. "Just do your job right from here on out." Morales nodded, his face somber, and followed Derek back to the cruiser. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of them lingering to thank Brianna or offer her their support. She accepted their kind words with quiet gratitude, her focus already shifting to the next steps she needed to take. As she left the park, her phone buzzing with notifications from friends and colleagues who had seen the live streams, Brianna felt a deep sense of resolve. This wasn't just about her, it was about standing up to the systemic abuse of power that people like Derek represented. And this was only the beginning. A morning of unease. The pre-dawn air was cool and crisp, a whisper of tranquility before the chaos of the day. Brianna Carter laced up her running shoes with meticulous care, her fingers deft and purposeful. Every knot tied wasn't just a preparation for her morning jog, it was a symbolic ritual, a reminder of the precision and strength her life demanded. As an FBI agent stationed in Atlanta, Brianna carried the weight of responsibility every single day. But this brief hour before the city fully awoke belonged solely to her. She stepped out onto the quiet street, the orange-pink glow of the rising sun painting the horizon. Her neighborhood was modest yet vibrant, alive with the murmurs of community life. Every step she took down the sidewalk carried her closer to Pine Grove Park, her sanctuary amid the bustling chaos of Atlanta. The park, with its winding paths and shimmering lake, was a haven for joggers, birdwatchers, and occasional yoga enthusiasts seeking peace. For Brianna, it was a place where she could temporarily silence the echoes of the hardened criminals, deceitful betrayals, and systemic corruption she dealt with on the job. As she entered the park, a gentle breeze played with the leaves of the towering oaks lining the pathway. Brianna popped in her earbuds, starting her morning playlist, a mix of smooth R&B tracks and instrumental beats. Her running app pinged as she activated her step tracker. Today, she promised herself, would be about focus and clarity. She planned to let her mind wander through possibilities for an ongoing case that had occupied her thoughts for weeks. Or maybe, she thought with a rare smile, she'd allow herself to think about nothing at all. Jogging steadily, Brianna tuned into the rhythm of her breathing and the crunch of her sneakers against the gravel path. The park was alive but not overcrowded. A couple walked hand in hand, their laughter breaking the stillness. A woman with a stroller sat on a bench near the lake, feeding crumbs to a group of ducks. Everything about the scene exuded normalcy, except for the lone patrol car parked just ahead. The cruiser's lights weren't flashing, and its engine idled with a low rumble. Inside, she could make out the shadowy figure of an officer sitting motionless behind the wheel. Brianna frowned slightly but continued her pace. The sight wasn't entirely out of place, local police often patrolled the area to ensure the safety of joggers and parkgoers. Yet something about this officer's posture, the deliberate stillness, sent a twinge of unease through her. He wasn't looking at his computer or even glancing around the park. He seemed focused, waiting, like a predator stalking prey. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling. Brianna wasn't one to jump to conclusions, and her experience taught her that intuition often required evidence to back it up. Still, she couldn't ignore her instincts. As a black woman and a federal agent, she had learned to navigate the complexities of authority, identity, and perception every single day. Something about the stillness of the scene didn't sit right. Adjusting her pace, she ran past the cruiser, her sharp eyes catching the officer's features briefly through the windshield. White, middle-aged, with a square jaw and close-cropped hair. His gaze followed her, not a casual glance, but something more deliberate. Brianna felt the prickle of his eyes on her back even as she moved further down the path. Still, she reminded herself that this was just a morning jog. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Yet. Minutes passed, and Brianna found herself loosening up as the rhythm of her run overtook her thoughts. Her body moved with an ease born from years of practice, her mind beginning to drift toward the case file she had left open on her dining room table. The still unsolved mystery of a missing informant gnawed at her, but before she could sink deeper into contemplation, her focus snapped back to the present. "Hey! You there! Stop right now!" The shout was sharp and commanding, slicing through the peaceful park like a blade. Brianna slowed and turned, her chest heaving slightly from the run. Behind her, the officer from the patrol car had exited his vehicle and was striding toward her, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered firearm. His blue uniform was immaculate, his badge gleaming under the sunlight. His name tag read D. Harrison. Brianna's heart rate picked up, not from the exertion of her jog, but from the recognition of trouble. Years of training kicked in. She pulled out her earbuds, her body instinctively shifting into a stance of composure and readiness. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Derek Harrison narrowed his eyes, his sunglasses perched on the bridge of his nose. "We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Brianna frowned. "I'm jogging. Like everyone else." She gestured around them, where a few other joggers were scattered along the paths, pausing to glance curiously at the interaction. "Is there a specific issue?" "You fit the description," Derek said, taking a step closer. His voice had dropped slightly, carrying an edge of menace. Late 20s to early 30s, athletic build. "You carrying any ID?" "No, I'm out for a run." "I didn't bring my wallet with me," Brianna replied evenly. Her tone remained calm, but she was acutely aware of his deliberate intrusion into her personal space. "If you'd like to share more details about the report, maybe I can help." Her composed response only seemed to agitate Derek further. His lips curled into a sneer, and he crossed his arms. "You need to stop being smart and answer my questions. You're acting suspicious by not cooperating." Brianna felt the familiar flicker of frustration but kept her emotions in check. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, "I've answered your questions. If there's nothing else, I'd like to continue my jog." "Not so fast," Derek barked, stepping closer. "You think you can just walk away? I'm not done with you." Brianna's mind raced. This wasn't the first time she had encountered an officer using intimidation tactics, but it was the first time she had faced it in such a public, casual setting. A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, joggers slowing down, passers-by pulling out their phones. The tension thickened in the air. As Derek's tone grew harsher, Brianna made a decision. She pulled her phone from the armband strapped to her bicep and opened the camera app. "I'm going to record this interaction," she said. "For my safety." That single action was enough to ignite Derek's anger. With a sudden, violent motion, he kicked the phone out of her hand, sending it skidding across the pavement. The sound of the impact echoed through the park, silencing the murmurs of the growing crowd. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as phones began recording the scene. For a moment, Brianna stood frozen, her eyes locked on Derek's. Then, slowly, she straightened her posture. Her gaze turned cold, her calm demeanor replaced by an unmistakable edge of authority. "Officer," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I suggest you pick up that phone." Derek smirked, folding his arms. Or what? Brianna reached into her pocket, retrieving the small, silver badge that symbolized her position. She held it up for Derek and the entire crowd to see. Or I'll have you explain your actions to the FBI.